Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session, running SQL Edge on a Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster. I love doing this because it combines three of my favorite technologies, SQL Server, Raspberry Pis, and Kubernetes. You know what Raspberry Pis are? They're a single board computer that can be used for a whole host of things. In this case, running Kubernetes. If you don't know what Kubernetes is, very briefly, it is a container orchestrator. If you're running containers in production, you want to use an orchestrator to manage them. There's a few options out there, things like Docker Swarm, but Kubernetes really is the leading technology in that area. So we're going to go with Kubernetes. Now, a while ago, Microsoft released something called Azure SQL Edge, which is basically SQL Server, but to be able to run on IoT devices. So things like Raspberry Pis. And when it first came out, you had to hook it up to an IoT hub up in Azure, and it was a bit of a kerfuffle. So they obviously listened to feedback and they allowed us to run Azure SQL Edge in something what's known as disconnected mode, which means we can just deploy Azure SQL Edge to an IoT device and we don't have to hook it up to Azure. So that's what we're going to do here really briefly. We are going to run Azure SQL Edge on Raspberry Pis on a Kubernetes cluster. So I've blogged about this from basically flashing the OS, even building the cluster itself, installing Kubernetes, and then deploying Azure SQL Edge. You can check it out there at the link there, and I'll post the links in the chat after the session as well. So I went off and I went and bought a whole load of stuff. And when it turned up, it was kind of like Christmas. I got a whole bunch of kits. It was absolutely fantastic. But I will say you don't need all of this stuff to run Kubernetes on a Raspberry Pi. You could do this on just one Raspberry Pi, and they do different models for the Raspberry Pi 4. They do the 8 gig of RAM one there, which I'm going to use for my control plane. The 4 gig of RAM was there for my worker nodes, and they also do a 2 gig RAM one. Now, 2 gig of RAM is pretty much the bare minimum you need for Kubernetes. But if you start throwing things like Azure SQL Edge in there, you're going to struggle a little bit. So I would recommend, if you're just going to run it all on one Raspberry Pi, go for a minimum of the 4 gig model. But I went with 4 nodes because, hey, I wanted to build a huge tower and play around with it and things like that. So I got 4 of them with the SD cards. I got a network switch and a USB hub to provide power. And I then had to go and build the whole thing. So had to spend pretty much an entire afternoon because I don't know if you're like me, but I am literally all thumbs. So many little screws, so many of them. They were everywhere. And I just had to spend pretty much an entire afternoon twiddling them in and building my cluster. But I will say it did come out rather nice, if I do say so myself. So now that I've got that cluster, I could flash the OS on the cards, plug it all together, plug all the cables in, power it on, and we ended up with something like this. Well, I'm saying something like this. This is exactly what I ended up with. So I've got my tower here. I've got my managementless switch here and my USB hub providing my power. Now, I went with manager switch because I'm not playing around with web portals and assigning ports and creating subnets. I literally just want to plug and play and go. And I'm not doing anything fancy with the IP addresses for the ports as well, for the Pis even. I'm just picking 4 IP addresses that weren't in use on my network and assigning them to the Pis. Plugging it all in, up it comes, and we are good to go with installing Kubernetes and then running Azure SQL Edge. One thing, if you're wondering what that little thing there is, that is a Pi0, and it is running Pi-hole. I highly recommend you check out Pi-hole. It is a network-wide ad blocker. It's absolutely fantastic. But okay, we've got our cluster. It's up and running. Let's go ahead and let's deploy Azure SQL Edge to it. So I'm going to make sure that I am pointing at the correct cluster, which looks good, and I can view my cluster nodes. Okay, we're getting some. There we go. Okay, so I've got my control plane, node 1, 2, and 3, running version 1.20. Now, 1.21 is the current version, so I have to go in and upgrade this at some point. But this is the beauty of having your own little cluster running just right beside me here. I can go in and I can practice upgrading, playing around with like the container runtime, because it's going to change from Docker to containerd at some point. So I can go in and I can play around with the Kubernetes internals and really learn Kubernetes without really having to worry that I'm going to nuke something like in my development environment in work or up in the cloud. If I nuke this, I can just wipe it all and rebuild it. It'll take about an hour. And that's the beauty of having your own Raspberry Pi Kubernetes cluster. So you've got the cluster. Let's go ahead and deploy Azure SQL Edge to it. So with Kubernetes, you can either use an imperative method to deploy. You can say, kube control, run this from this image with all this, and basically tell Kubernetes what to do. Or you can use a declarative method, which is basically taking a YAML file, slam it into Kubernetes, and Kubernetes will work out what's in that YAML file and deploy what's required. So let's have a quick look at that YAML file, shall we? So it's a big, long thing, but basically what we're saying here is we've got a type of deployment called Azure SQL Edge. We're going to run one pod running Azure SQL Edge. And then we're coming down here to the container itself, giving it a name and running from the Azure SQL Edge latest version up in the Microsoft Container Registry, the MCR. We're going to open up some ports, port 1433, pretty standard for SQL Server and Azure SQL Edge. Then a whole bunch of environment variables. We're going to set the addition to developer, accept the end user license agreement, set an SA password, enable the agent, set a collation, and set the language ID, which is going to be English. Now that's deploying Azure SQL Edge, but we want to be able to connect to it too. So we need something what's called a service. So we're going to deploy that as well in this YAML file, and we're going to define it here. So we got our service. We're going to call it Azure SQL Edge service. We're going to open up some port. We're going to map some ports even. We're going to map port 1433 on the service to 1433 to the pod. So anything hitting our service from outside of our cluster on port 1433 will be mapped through, and we'll be able to connect to Azure SQL Edge. And then finally, we have a type of load balancer. Now, if you deploy this up in the cloud, you will get a load balancer, which will give you an external IP, which you can use to connect to apps within the cluster from outside of it. Now, obviously, I've got a Raspberry Pi cluster sitting on my desktop here. I don't have a load balancer to use. So what I'm using is a program called MetalLB. And what that'll do is it'll simulate a load balancer and give me that external IP that I need. So let's go ahead and let's deploy that into our cluster. So I'm going to say kube control apply, and then my big long path to my YAML file. Hit go. Deployment created, service created. All's looking good. So let's confirm that. Let's get all and see what's on that cluster. Aha. Okay. So we have our pod, status of running, always good. And then we have our service with a type of load balancer. And there's our external IP address. So that's what we're going to use to connect from my laptop into my cluster and connect to Azure SQL Edge. Then we got our deployment and the replica set behind the deployment. But let's go and see if we can connect in. And what I'm doing here is just getting a variable, and this big long line of code, all that's doing is pulling out that external IP address. And then I'm going to drop that external IP address into my MS SQL CLI statement. Now, if you haven't checked out the MS SQL CLI, highly recommend you do. It's like SQL command on steroids. It gives you some really cool things like IntelliSense for your queries. But I'm just going to use it in a line here just to get the version and see if we can connect into SQL Edge running on my Kubernetes Raspberry Pi cluster. So let's give it a play. And fingers crossed, let's see if this comes back with a version for us. Boom, there we go. We have our version. So we can connect from outside of our cluster into using our external IP and connect to Azure SQL Edge. And you can see we've got the developer edition, RTM, running on ARM because it's on a Raspberry Pi. Now that's great, but we've kind of configured a stateless version of SQL Edge there, the Azure SQL Edge. So if I blow that pod away, I will lose any data changes. So we want to kind of configure some storage for our cluster. And I've blogged about this as well, and I'll post a link in the chat about building an NFS server, again on a Raspberry Pi, that we can use to provide storage into the cluster. So that if we make any data changes for Azure SQL Edge, if we blow that pod away, new one spins up, we retain our data. So the full details are there, but I went out and bought yet another Raspberry Pi, and hey, why not have a really cool case? Saw this on Twitter and was like, yes, thank you, I will have that. Bang. Bought that, configured it, and now I will show you the complete setup that I have for my Raspberry Pi setup. I will say I've actually moved since I built this session, and it's all down here, and I wasn't taking a photograph of this because it looks terrible. But what we have is we have our network hub, USB hub, NFS server, the Raspberry Pi tower, a VPN server. So when in-person conferences are a thing and I want to do this session again, I can connect it to my VPN server and I'll be able to connect to my Raspberry Pi cluster. And then finally, I have a Pi tablet here, which is connected into my Pi-hole web portal, so I can get some stats on like the adverts being blocked and stuff like that on my network. So that's my full setup. And I will say I am now completely banned from buying any more Raspberry Pis. Thank you.